The city of Aurelian Heights woke up before the sun. Tall buildings glowed faintly in the early morning haze, their glass faces reflecting a world built on quiet power and silent decisions. Long before executives arrived in polished cars, long before assistants switched on their computers, one woman was already inside the largest building on the boulevard. Her name was Eldra Covain. But no one there knew that. To them, she was just an old cleaner. She wore faded clothes that hung loosely on her thin frame. A scarf covered her graying hair, tied without care. Her shoes were simple rubber sandals, worn down by years of walking. In one hand, she held a mop. In the other, a bucket of water that sloshed softly as she walked. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step required effort. But behind her tired eyes was a sharp awareness. She noticed everything. Every whisper. Every glance. Every laugh that stopped too late. This building belonged to her. Every floor. Every office. Every powerful name written on its walls. And today, she had come not as an owner, but as a test. When Eldra pushed open the glass doors of the main office floor, conversations paused. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Then came the laughter. Who let her in here? She looks lost. Isn't there a back entrance for people like this? Eldra lowered her head and said nothing. She dipped her mop into the bucket and began cleaning the spotless marble floor. She had learned long ago that silence made people reveal themselves faster than words ever could. As she worked, she scanned the room quietly. Most faces carried the same expression, mild disgust, impatience, superiority. Then she noticed one desk. A young woman sat there, focused on her screen. She did not laugh. She did not stare. She did not smirk or whisper to anyone beside her. Her name was Serene Olathe. She didn't know yet that she was being watched. Later that morning, the test deepened. A sharp heel stepped deliberately into Eldra's bucket. Water spilled across the floor. "Oh dear," a smooth voice said. "Careful, old woman." It was Maribel Thorne. Elegant. Confident. Cruel in a way that wore expensive perfume. Eldra pretended to lose balance. Her body tilted, and she fell hard onto the floor. Pain shot through her side. Laughter exploded around her. "She's too old for this. Why don't they just replace her?" No one moved. No one reached out. No one, except Serene. She pushed her chair back and crossed the room quickly. "Kneel slowly," she whispered as she took Eldra's arm. "I've got you." Her grip was firm. Respectful. Eldra looked up into her eyes. There was concern there. Not pity. Not performance. Just humanity. Something tightened in Eldra's chest. That afternoon, Eldra cleaned the break room while conversations floated carelessly around her. Maribel and her circle entered laughing. "What is that smell?" someone said. Eldra sat alone at a small table, eating the simple food she had brought from home. Maribel glanced at her bowl and wrinkled her nose. "That's why cleaners should eat outside." Eldra continued eating. Serene entered moments later. She paused when she saw Eldra sitting alone. Then she walked over and sat beside her. "Good afternoon," she said gently. Eldra nodded. "Good afternoon, my child." Serene tasted the food when Eldra offered. "It tastes like home," she said with a smile. Maribel stared. The room went quiet. That night, Eldra wrote in her notebook under dim light. Kindness without reward. Courage without audience. She closed the book. The test was working. 3 days later, the building shifted. Security stood straighter. Voices lowered. Eyes watched the elevators. Selim Covain had returned. He stepped out dressed simply, but authority followed him like a shadow. As he walked through the office, he noticed something that didn't sit right. An elderly woman mopping the floor. He stopped. "Why is she doing this work?" he asked. Maribel smiled quickly. "She's just the cleaner." Selim's eyes hardened. "There is no such thing as just." Serene heard everything. So did Eldra. Later, Selim asked to meet the young woman who had spoken up. Serene stood before him, nervous but steady. "You helped her," he said. "She needed help," Serene replied. "Nothing more. Nothing less." For the first time since returning home, Selim felt something stir. That evening, Eldra invited Serene to dinner. The house was modest but warm. As they ate, Eldra spoke softly. "Be careful," she said. "Kind hearts attract dangerous people." Serene nodded slowly. She did not know how true those words were. The message arrived the next day. A hotel. A time. A demand. Maribel sat waiting with an envelope of money. "Take this," she said. "Leave the company." Serene pushed it back. "No." Maribel's smile vanished. "You'll regret this." From a distant corner of the restaurant, Eldra watched everything. The test was nearing its most dangerous phase. This is the true beginning. Serene walked out of the hotel with her heart pounding, the night air cool against her skin. She did not look back. She did not need to. Some threats did not require answers. They revealed themselves by their existence alone. By the time she reached her small apartment, exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall, replaying Maribel's smile in her mind. It had not been anger that frightened her. It was confidence. The kind that came from knowing she had power. Across the city, Eldra sat alone in her quiet living room. The lights were low. Her food had gone cold. She held her tea untouched, her thoughts sharp and restless. The young woman had passed the test. Not just the test of kindness, but the harder one. The test of integrity when desperation stood inches away. Eldra closed her eyes briefly. The next phase would not be gentle. The following morning, the office buzzed with a different kind of energy. Whispers traveled faster than emails. Eyes followed Serene as she walked to her desk. Some curious. Some amused. Some openly hostile. She felt it immediately. Something was wrong. Maribel stood near the center of the room, phone in hand, lips curved in a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Everyone," she said lightly, raising her voice just enough to gather attention. "This is interesting. You should hear this." Before Serene could react, a recording played. Her voice filled the room. Twisted. Edited. Stripped of context. It sounded like arrogance. Like scheming. Like confession. Laughter erupted. "So that's the innocent one? She's just like the rest of us." Serene felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers curled into fists, nails biting into her palms. She opened her mouth to speak, but the room had already decided who she was. She stood there, breathing slowly, refusing to cry. From the hallway, Eldra watched. Every laugh etched itself into her memory. Every face. Every sound. This was cruelty without consequence. For now. The doors to the executive wing opened, and Selim stepped out. Silence fell instantly. He looked around, his eyes landing on Serene. She stood rigid, surrounded by judgment, her chin lifted despite it all. "What is going on?" he asked. Maribel smiled sweetly. "Just a misunderstanding. Office humor." Selim's gaze sharpened. "Humor does not humiliate," he said calmly. "My office. Now. Maribel's smile wavered for the first time. That afternoon, Serene worked quietly, her vision blurring at times. She told herself to endure. She had done nothing wrong. Truth had a way of surviving. She was wrong. 2 days later, just before dawn, loud knocks shattered her sleep. She opened the door to see uniformed officers standing in the hallway. "Serene Olathe," one said. "You are under arrest for financial fraud." Her world tilted. Handcuffs closed around her wrists as neighbors peeked through cracked doors. Shame burned hotter than fear. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. No one listened. At the station, hours passed like years. Her mind spun, searching for logic, for sense, for mercy. Then she saw Eldra. Standing quietly at the desk. Waiting. Serene broke down. "I swear I'm innocent," she cried. "I know," Eldra said softly, pulling her into an embrace. "I know." When Serene was released on bail, the city had already begun to judge her. Headlines spread faster than truth. Selim stared at the news on his phone, his chest tight. It did not make sense. Missing funds had been traced to an account in Serene's name. Clean trails. Too clean. Someone wanted her destroyed. That night, Selim visited Eldra's house, not knowing why his feet had brought him there. He found Serene sitting quietly, eyes swollen, spirit bruised. "Tell me the truth," he said gently. "Did you take the money?" She looked at him, hurt flashing through her exhaustion. "No." He searched her face. She did not look like a liar. He left without a promise, but with resolve. The next morning, Selim ordered a private investigation. Cameras were missing. Logs altered. Access rerouted. Someone inside the company had planned this carefully. Meanwhile, Maribel celebrated quietly, convinced she had won. She slept peacefully for the first time in days. At exactly 3 in the morning, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You went too far." Her breath caught. She tried to call back. No answer. The next day, the board was summoned. So was the police. And Eldra Covain walked into the boardroom wearing something very different from a faded wrapper. Silence swallowed the room whole. She stood tall. Unhidden. Unbroken. "My name," she said calmly, "is Eldra Covain. And this test is over." Eldra did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The boardroom sat frozen, every polished face turned toward her as though time itself had paused. The woman they had mocked, ignored, stepped over, now stood before them with a presence that bent the air. Some recognized her immediately. Others needed a second longer. A chair scraped loudly as one board member stood up in shock. "Madame Covain," he whispered. Eldra's eyes moved slowly across the room. "I watched," she said, calm and measured, as people revealed who they truly are when they believed no one important was looking. No one spoke. Outside the glass walls, staff gathered, drawn by the sudden stillness, the tension that rolled through the building like an approaching storm. Maribel sat rigid in her seat, color draining from her face. This was not how it was supposed to end. Eldra turned slightly. "Bring her in." The doors opened. Serene stepped into the room. She hesitated, confused by the sight of executives standing, by the silence, by the way everyone suddenly avoided her eyes. Eldra faced her. "My child," she said gently, "you have done nothing wrong." Serene's breath caught. Selim stood slowly. "Mother," he said quietly. The room shattered. Gasps rippled through the boardroom. "Mother." Serene's knees nearly gave way. Eldra placed a steady hand on her arm. "I came here as a cleaner," Eldra continued, "because wealth blinds people. Power excuses cruelty. And inheritance hides rot. Her gaze landed on Maribel. You, she said softly, were very confident. Maribel stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, she snapped. She's manipulating everyone. Serene stole that money. The records. The records, Eldra interrupted, were altered by your access card. A screen lit up behind her. Footage played. Clear. Untouched. Maribel entering restricted offices. Maribel transferring files. Maribel smiling as she erased logs. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Yold buried her face in her hands. Security stepped forward. Maribel collapsed into her chair, shaking. This company, Eldra said, turning back to the room, was built on discipline. On dignity. On the belief that no one is invisible. She looked at Serene again. You were kind when no one was watching. You were honest when being dishonest would have saved you. That matters. Tears slid down Serene's face. I was just trying to be human, she whispered. Eldra smiled. That is rare. Maribel was escorted out screaming. The doors closed. Silence returned. But it was different now. That evening, the city lights flickered on as Serene sat on Eldra's veranda, wrapped in a light shawl. The night air was calm. Healing. I don't know how to thank you, Serene said softly. Eldra shook her head. You already did. Selim stood nearby, watching the two women. For the first time, he saw clearly. Not wealth. Not status. But strength. Days passed. Then weeks. The story spread, but not the way gossip usually did. This time, it carried consequence. Policies changed. Executives were removed. Quiet workers were promoted. And Serene returned to the office, not as a symbol, but as herself. One afternoon, Selim joined her by the window. I doubted you, he said honestly. She nodded. I know. I'm sorry. She met his eyes. So am I. But we're still here. They stood in silence, the city moving below them. Some endings do not close doors. They open them slowly. Eldra watched from her office, the notebook closed forever. The test was complete. Not because power had spoken. But because kindness had survived. And in a world that often forgets what matters, that was everything. The days that followed did not feel triumphant. They felt quiet. Too quiet. For Serene, silence was heavier than noise. She woke each morning expecting whispers, expecting eyes that judged, expecting doors to close in her face. Instead, people greeted her cautiously. Some with guilt. Some with admiration. Some with fear. She did not know which was worse. When she returned to her desk, it was no longer the same one. HR had moved her closer to the window, closer to the executive wing. The chair was new. The computer newer. Everything felt undeserved. She placed her bag down slowly and sat. Her hands trembled. Across the office, conversations softened when she arrived. Not out of respect, but awareness. People had learned something dangerous. That power could be watching. And kindness could be remembered. Eldra spent those days behind closed doors. She met with lawyers. With auditors. With people whose names never appeared on company websites. Each meeting peeled back another layer of decay that had settled unnoticed over the years. She was not angry. Anger wasted energy. She was precise. One by one, contracts were reviewed. Promotions questioned. Quiet abuses surfaced. People who had never imagined consequences now faced them calmly, professionally, without spectacle. That frightened them more than shouting ever could. Selim watched his mother closely. He had always known she was formidable. He had not known she was surgical. "You could have stopped it earlier," he said one evening as they sat across from each other, the city lights glowing beyond the glass. "Yes," Eldra replied. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him then. "Because I needed to know who you were too." Selim frowned slightly. "I didn't fail her," he said quietly. "No," Eldra agreed. "But you doubted her." He lowered his eyes. "I was raised to trust systems. Evidence. Structure. And she trusted people," Eldra said. "Despite the cost." Selim leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I want to learn that." Serene tried to return to normal. She focused on her work. Ate lunch quietly. Avoided unnecessary conversations. At night, she lay awake listening to the city breathe, replaying moments she wished she could erase. The arrest. The laughter. The way her voice had sounded when she said she was innocent. Sometimes she wondered if she would ever feel untouched again. One evening, Eldra knocked on her door. "Come walk with me," she said. They strolled through the neighborhood slowly, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. "You are allowed to rest," Eldra said. Serene smiled faintly. "I don't know how." Eldra nodded. "That is something many good people forget." They stopped at a small park. Children laughed in the distance. Somewhere, music played softly from an open window. "I didn't bring you into my life to reward you," Eldra said gently. "I brought you because you reminded me who I was before wealth complicated everything." Serene swallowed. "I was just being myself." "That," Eldra said, "is exactly why." Time moved forward. The headlines faded. Maribel's name disappeared from conversations, replaced by cautionary whispers and legal footnotes. Yold resigned quietly. Others followed. The building felt lighter. Still powerful. But cleaner in ways no mop could achieve. One afternoon, Selim asked Serene to join him for coffee. Not as a superior. Not as an obligation. Just as two people sitting across from each other. "I won't pretend I understand what you went through," he said. "But I want to understand who you are." She studied him for a long moment. "Then don't rush," she said. He smiled. "I won't." Weeks turned into months. Serene found herself laughing again, softly at first, then freely. She began mentoring new staff. Quietly. Without speeches. Without needing recognition. Eldra watched from a distance. Satisfied. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Eldra returned to the janitor's closet one last time. The mop stood where she had left it. The bucket was dry. She touched the handle gently. Then she turned off the light and closed the door. Some roles were meant to be temporary. Some lessons permanent. Years later, people would speak of Covain Holdings as a company that changed. They would credit leadership. Policy. Vision. Few would know the truth. That it all began with an old woman pretending to be invisible. And a young woman who refused to treat her that way. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions happen quietly. One kind act at a time. One choice no one applauds. One moment that proves who you are when you think it doesn't matter. And in the end, that was the real inheritance. Not money. Not power. But the courage to remain human. The story did not end when the company healed. Life never ends that neatly. Serene learned that in the months that followed. Even when justice is served, scars remain. She still paused whenever she heard sudden laughter behind her. She still flinched when her phone rang late at night. Some mornings, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, reminding herself that she was safe. Healing, Eldra reminded her, was not forgetting. It was choosing not to let the memory decide who you become. Eldra herself changed too. Not in posture. Not in authority. But in patience. She no longer hid behind tests or disguises. She spent time on the lower floors of the building, speaking to cleaners, security guards, junior staff. Listening more than talking. People were startled at first. Then grateful. Then loyal in a way money could never buy. Selim watched all of this unfold quietly. One afternoon, he joined Serene for lunch without announcing himself. No assistants. No schedule. She raised an eyebrow when she saw him. "You're late," she said. He smiled. "I wanted to see if you'd wait." She shook her head, amused. "Still testing people?" "Learning," he replied. They talked about ordinary things. Music. Books. How strange it felt to be young and tired at the same time. It wasn't dramatic. And that made it real. Eldra observed them from a distance. She did not interfere. Some bonds needed space to grow without expectation. As the year turned, Covain Holdings launched a quiet initiative. No press conference. No slogans. Anonymous reporting channels. Transparent promotion audits. Mandatory empathy training for leadership. People laughed at first. Then the laughter stopped. One evening, Serene received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Inside were 3 words. "I'm sorry. Truly." No name. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, she had learned, did not require reconciliation. On a rainy night months later, the city experienced a blackout. The building went dark. Emergency lights flickered on. Employees froze. Then laughter broke out. Unplanned. Human. Serene stood beside Eldra near the windows, watching the city dim. "You changed more than a company," Serene said softly. Eldra shook her head. "No," she replied. "You did." Selim joined them, holding 3 cups of hot tea. "Power outage," he said. "But somehow, everything feels clearer." Eldra smiled. When the lights returned, something else had switched on too. Trust. Years later, when Eldra finally stepped back from daily operations, the company did not crumble. It steadied. Selim led with restraint. Serene led with compassion. Neither ruled alone. On Eldra's last official day, there was no ceremony. No speeches. She walked the building one final time. From the executive floor. To the break room. To the janitor's closet. She paused there. Smiled. Then walked away. Serene stood at the window as Eldra's car disappeared into traffic. She felt no fear. Only gratitude. Because she understood something now. That kindness is not weakness. Silence is not invisibility. And dignity, once chosen, cannot be taken away. Somewhere deep within the city, new buildings rose. New companies formed. New tests began. But the lesson remained. You never know who is watching. You never know who you are teaching. And you never know how one small act can change everything. Time continued its quiet march forward. Not with announcements. Not with applause. But with ordinary mornings that slowly became lighter. Serene began to sleep through the night. At first, it surprised her. She would wake just before dawn, confused by the absence of fear. No racing heart. No sudden panic. Just the distant hum of the city and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She learned to sit with that peace instead of questioning it, At work, she no longer avoided eye contact. When new staff joined the company, nervous and unsure, they often found themselves drawn to her desk. She explained systems patiently. She listened without interrupting. She remembered names. People trusted her instinctively. Not because of what had happened to her, but because of how she treated them after. Sometimes, she caught Eldra watching her from across the office floor. Not as a supervisor. Not as an owner. But as someone quietly proud. Eldra spent more time outside the company now. She visited schools funded anonymously by the foundation she had established years earlier. She sat in classrooms at the back, listening to children read aloud, smiling at their confidence. No one introduced her. No one needed to. One afternoon, while walking through a local market, a woman stopped her. "You look familiar," the woman said. Eldra smiled politely. "Perhaps," she replied. And kept walking. Selim found himself changing too. He stopped measuring success by numbers alone. He began asking questions that made people uncomfortable in the right ways. Who spoke the least in meetings? Why? Who carried the most work without recognition? Who benefited quietly while others struggled loudly? Leadership, he realized, was not about being admired. It was about being accountable. One evening, he and Serene walked along the river as the city lights reflected across the water. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "my mother never wanted me to inherit the company." Serene glanced at him. "She wanted me to inherit responsibility." She nodded slowly. "That's heavier." "Yes," he agreed. "But it feels right." They stopped at the railing. No promises were made. None were needed. Some connections grew best without labels. As seasons changed, the story faded into memory for most people. New scandals replaced old ones. New names filled headlines. But within Covain Holdings, something remained different. Cruelty no longer felt safe. There were still disagreements. Still mistakes. Still ambition. But there was also pause. Reflection. A sense that someone, somewhere, might be watching, not to punish, but to remember. One quiet morning, Serene found a small package on her desk. Inside was a notebook. The first page was blank. The second held a single line, written in careful handwriting. "Never stop noticing." She smiled. She knew exactly who it was from. That evening, she visited Eldra's home. They drank tea in comfortable silence. "I think I understand now," Serene said after a while. "Understand what?" Eldra asked. "Why you did it. The disguise. The waiting." Eldra looked out the window. "Power reveals nothing," she said. "Time does." They sat there until the sky darkened. No rush. No urgency. Just presence. Years later, when Serene stood before a room full of young professionals as a mentor, she told them a simple story. Not about betrayal. Not about arrest. Not about exposure. She told them about a woman who fell on a marble floor. And a hand that reached out without thinking. She never mentioned names. She didn't need to. Because some stories are not meant to be repeated. They are meant to be lived. And somewhere, in a city that still believed power was loud and kindness was small, an old woman smiled quietly, knowing the truth. That the world does not change all at once. It changes when one person chooses to see another. Even when no one is watching. The city did not notice when Eldra finally stopped attending meetings. There were no announcements. No emails. No farewell dinners. She simply became less visible again. But this time, invisibility was a choice. Her mornings were slower now. She woke with the sun instead of before it. She watered the plants on her balcony by hand, feeling the cool soil between her fingers. Sometimes she sat for long stretches doing nothing at all, listening to the sounds of life moving forward without her direction. She had spent decades controlling outcomes. Now she practiced letting them unfold. Serene visited often. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Silence between them was no longer heavy. It was companionable. The kind that didn't ask to be filled. One afternoon, Serene arrived looking unsettled. "I almost didn't come today," she admitted. Eldra looked at her calmly. "Why?" "I was afraid," Serene said after a pause. "Not of anything specific. Just, afraid that peace doesn't last." Eldra nodded slowly. "That fear," she said, "is the echo of survival. It fades when you stop arguing with it." Serene exhaled. At the company, Selim faced resistance. Not openly. Not dramatically. But subtly. Old habits clung tightly to those who benefited from them. Some executives smiled and nodded, then delayed changes quietly. Others tested boundaries, waiting to see how far they could push before consequences returned. Selim did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He documented. He waited. And when action came, it was precise. People learned that patience could be more dangerous than anger. Late one evening, Selim stayed behind long after the building emptied. He walked the halls alone, stopping at the break room, then the quiet corridor where Eldra had once fallen. He stood there for a long time. Leadership, he realized, was lonely not because people left, but because illusion did. Serene's life outside work began to grow again. She reconnected with old friends she had withdrawn from during the chaos. Some relationships had changed. Others had survived quietly, waiting. She took long walks. She returned to reading novels instead of legal documents and policy manuals. She laughed more freely, surprised sometimes by the sound of it. One night, she dreamed of the marble floor. But this time, when the fall came, there was no laughter. Only hands reaching out. She woke with tears on her face and relief in her chest. Eldra, meanwhile, began writing again. Not lists. Not evaluations. Stories. Fragments of memory. Moments she had never spoken aloud. Failures she had buried under success. Names of people she wished she had protected sooner. Writing was slower than running a company. But it was honest. One passage she returned to often read simply. "I mistook control for safety. Kindness taught me the difference." Years passed. Not dramatically. Just steadily. Serene eventually accepted a leadership role she had once believed she wasn't ready for. She doubted herself on the first day. Questioned every decision. Felt the familiar pull of fear. Then she remembered the hand that had reached out without thinking. And she chose to lead the same way. On her first day in that role, a young intern spilled coffee across the conference table during a meeting. The room went still. Serene stood up, grabbed a napkin, and helped clean. The intern cried quietly with relief. No one laughed. Eldra heard about it later and smiled to herself. Selim never rushed his relationship with Serene. They shared meals. Conversations. Long pauses that didn't need explanation. Some people asked questions. He ignored them. He had learned that what mattered most did not require defense. One evening, years later, they stood together at a company event honoring community workers. Not executives. Not investors. Janitors. Guards. Assistants. People who rarely stood under lights. As applause filled the room, Serene felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She leaned toward Selim and whispered, "This feels like her." He nodded. Yes, he said. It does. When Eldra passed quietly in her sleep many years later, the city did not stop. Traffic continued. Markets opened. Buildings stood tall. But inside Covain Holdings, work paused. Not for spectacle. For respect. At her memorial, Sareen spoke briefly. She taught me, she said, voice steady, that dignity is not granted by position. It is revealed by behavior. She stepped down without applause. Later that evening, Sareen returned to the small park where she had once walked with Eldra. She sat on the bench alone. The air was calm. Children laughed in the distance. Life continued. She closed her eyes and whispered a thank you. Not to the woman who owned everything. But to the woman who chose to clean floors to understand hearts. And somewhere beyond titles and tests, beyond wealth and walls, that choice continued to ripple outward. Quietly. Patiently. Changing things one unseen moment at a time. The bench felt cool beneath Sareen's hands as she sat there longer than she had planned. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was letting the moment finish speaking. The city carried on around her, unaware of the quiet shift that had already happened inside her. She understood now that grief did not always arrive as pain. Sometimes it arrived as clarity. As a deep stillness that made everything else fall into place. Eldra had not left her instructions. She had left her understanding. In the weeks after the memorial, Sareen returned to work with a new kind of calm. Not confidence. Calm was different. Confidence needed reassurance. Calm simply existed. When conflicts arose, she listened longer. When mistakes happened, she corrected without humiliation. When praise came, she redirected it gently. People noticed. They always did. Selim watched her from across meeting tables and conference rooms, seeing not just competence, but steadiness. The kind that held others upright without demanding attention. One evening, as they walked out of the building together, he spoke quietly. She would be proud of you. Sareen nodded. I know. They stood for a moment by the steps. The city lights flickered on one by one. Do you ever feel like we're just carrying something forward? Selim asked. Sareen thought about it. Yes, she said. But not as a burden. He smiled at that. Years continued to pass. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just faithfully. New faces filled the offices. Some ambitious. Some uncertain. Some kind in ways they didn't yet recognize. Sareen made it a habit to learn their names early. To remember small details. To notice who spoke less and who carried more than they should. Sometimes she caught herself doing things Eldra once did. Standing back. Watching. Listening. She smiled when she realized it. One afternoon, she found a young cleaner sitting alone in the break room, eating quietly as others talked around her. Without thinking, Sareen walked over and sat beside her. They spoke about ordinary things. Weather. Food. Life. Nothing important. Everything important. Selim's leadership matured into something rare. He stopped being compared to his mother. Not because he surpassed her. But because he honored her without copying her. The company stabilized. Then quietly thrived. Not because fear drove it. But because people felt seen. Outside of work, Sareen's life widened. She traveled. She volunteered. She allowed herself joy without guilt. Some evenings, she returned home exhausted in the best way, the way that comes from living fully, not surviving narrowly. There were moments she still felt the echo of the past. A sudden noise. A sharp laugh. A locked door. But the echo no longer controlled her. It passed. One night, as rain tapped softly against her window, Serene opened the old notebook Eldra had once given her. The pages were filled now. Thoughts. Observations. Questions without answers. On the last page, she wrote, "I will notice." She closed the notebook gently. Years later, long after titles changed and buildings expanded, someone new would enter Covain Holdings for the first time. Nervous. Unsure. Invisible. And somewhere nearby, someone would notice them. Offer space. Offer patience. Offer dignity. Not because of policy. Not because of reward. But because one woman, long ago, chose to fall on a marble floor. And another chose to reach out. And so the story continued. Not as legend. Not as rumor. But as quiet proof that humanity, when practiced daily, becomes legacy. Not inherited. Not announced. Simply lived. The mornings grew softer with time. Not easier. Not perfect. Just softer around the edges. Serene learned to recognize that softness when it arrived. It was in the way she no longer rushed through silence. In how she allowed pauses in conversation without trying to fix them. In how she trusted herself to respond rather than react. She had once lived braced for impact. Now she lived attentive to presence. One autumn morning, as golden light spilled across the office windows, Serene noticed a man standing uncertainly near the entrance. He held a folder too tightly, his shoulders drawn inward. He looked like someone who had already been told no too many times. She stood and walked over. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "I'm here for an interview." "I think I'm early." She smiled. "Early is good," she said. "Come sit." He exhaled, relief visible. From across the floor, Selim noticed. He always did. Eldra's presence still lingered in small ways. In policies that required explanation, not obedience. In meeting rooms arranged in circles instead of hierarchies. In the absence of fear where it once thrived. People who had never known her spoke her name with respect they could not explain. Those who had known her spoke it with gratitude. Some evenings, Serene returned to the old park alone. She liked the bench. It reminded her that stillness was not emptiness. On one such evening, an elderly woman sat beside her without asking. They shared the bench in silence for a while. Finally, the woman spoke. "People think kindness is weakness," she said. Serene smiled faintly. "Yes," she replied. "They're usually the ones afraid to practice it." The woman nodded, as if hearing confirmation rather than learning something new. At work, Selim faced a difficult decision. An executive had delivered strong results but left quiet harm in his wake. Complaints were subtle. Patterns undeniable. The board hesitated. Selim didn't. He made the call. There was backlash. There always was. But there was also relief, unspoken, widespread. Leadership, he realized again, was choosing who you protect. That night, he told Serene about it over dinner. She listened carefully. "You did the right thing," she said. He nodded slowly. "It still cost something." She met his eyes. "It always does." They walked home together afterward, the city humming around them. Their steps matched without effort. Years passed. Gray touched Selim's hair at the temples. Serene's laughter deepened, warmer with experience. They never rushed to define what they were to each other. They simply kept showing up. On a quiet afternoon, Serene found herself alone in the janitor's closet again. Not by accident. She stood where Eldra once had, holding nothing but memory. The room smelled faintly of soap. She closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Life continued to test people. It always would. But not all tests came with disguises or power plays. Some came quietly. As moments of choice. A decision to listen. A decision to help. A decision to stay human when cruelty felt easier. And somewhere, in an office filled with light and ordinary people doing their best, those decisions were being made every day. Not perfectly. But sincerely. That was enough. Because the greatest stories are not the ones that end. They are the ones that keep teaching long after the last word is spoken. And this one was still being written. The building breathed differently now. Not because the walls had changed, or the glass had been replaced, but because the people inside it carried themselves with less armor. Conversations were slower. Disagreements were quieter, but more honest. Apologies happened without being forced. Serene noticed it in small moments. A manager waiting for a junior staff member to finish speaking. A security guard being thanked by name. A cleaner invited to sit instead of stand. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. Some evenings, after the floors emptied and the city dimmed, Serene stayed behind. Not to work. Just to sit at her desk and look out at the skyline. She liked watching lights turn on one by one, imagining the lives unfolding behind them. She thought often about how close she had come to disappearing. Not physically. But internally. If she had taken the money. If she had stayed silent. If she had decided kindness wasn't worth the cost. She wondered how many people made those choices every day without anyone ever knowing. Selim joined her one night without a word. They stood side by side, hands resting on the glass. "Do you ever miss how things were?" he asked quietly. She considered the question. "No," she said. "But I remember it. So I don't recreate it." He nodded. "That's leadership," he said. She smiled. "That's survival," she corrected. Outside the company, the city continued its rhythm. New businesses rose. Old ones fell. People chased success the way they always had. But somewhere beneath the noise, something quieter had taken root. Serene began speaking at small gatherings. Not conferences. Workshops. Rooms where people still believed their voices were too small to matter. She never told the full story. She told pieces. Enough to remind people that dignity wasn't a luxury. It was a practice. One evening, a young woman approached her afterward, eyes shining. "I didn't think people like you existed," she said. Serene felt a familiar ache in her chest. "I'm ordinary," she replied. "I just chose not to look away." Eldra's house remained exactly as she had left it. The plants still thrived. The books remained where her hands had placed them. Sometimes Serene sat in the living room alone, listening to the quiet, feeling held by it. She understood now that mentorship didn't end with absence. It echoed. Years later, when Serene faced a decision that would change the course of the company, she didn't rush it. She walked. She thought. She listened. And when the moment came, she chose people over profit. The numbers recovered. They always did. Trust took longer. But it lasted. Selim watched the decision unfold and felt something loosen inside him. His mother had built something strong. Serene was making it humane. On an ordinary morning that felt anything but, Serene arrived early and found a new cleaner struggling with a broken cart. She knelt without hesitation. "Let me help," she said. The cleaner stared, startled. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," Serene replied. "I want to." As they fixed the wheel together, the sun rose fully over the city. Light poured through the windows. Unremarkable. Perfect. And somewhere, in the quiet space between who people were and who they chose to be, the legacy continued. Not written on plaques. Not carved into stone. But carried, gently, deliberately, from one human moment to the next. Because in the end, the world is not changed by those who are seen. It is changed by those who see. And choose to act anyway. Morning came with a pale sky and the sound of traffic waking up below. Serene stood at her window longer than usual, watching the city stretch itself into motion. There was comfort in knowing the day would unfold whether she rushed or not. That realization alone felt like freedom. She dressed simply and left her apartment with no sense of urgency. Inside the building, the air felt familiar. Not heavy. Not tense. Just alive with quiet purpose. People moved with intention instead of fear. That difference still amazed her. She passed the reception desk and greeted the guard by name. He smiled. That smile followed her down the corridor. Later that morning, a meeting grew tense. Two departments disagreed sharply over a decision that would affect dozens of workers. Voices rose. Shoulders stiffened. Old instincts tried to reassert themselves. Serene listened. She waited until the noise exhausted itself. Then she spoke. "Before we decide," she said calmly, "has anyone asked the people this will affect?" Silence. One by one, heads turned. No one had. The meeting paused. Then shifted. By the end of the day, a new plan existed. Slower. Fairer. Slightly less profitable in the short term. No one complained. They had learned what mattered. That evening, Selim waited by the elevator. "You changed the direction of that meeting," he said as they walked out together. She shrugged lightly. "I just asked a question." He smiled. "That's usually how it starts." They walked through the city as the sun dipped low, the light turning buildings amber. Street vendors packed up. Music drifted from passing cars. Life moved around them, unaware of how many small decisions shaped its rhythm. "Do you ever think about leaving all this?" Selim asked. Serene thought for a moment. "No," she said. "But I think about simplifying it." He nodded. I think she would have liked that answer. She smiled softly. On the weekend, Serene visited the foundation Eldra had quietly supported for years. She sat with students, listened to their hopes, their fears, their impatience to become something before they understood themselves. She recognized that feeling. "You don't have to rush," she told them. "You don't have to harden." Some looked skeptical. Some looked relieved. As months passed, Serene noticed something else changing. Her voice. It no longer shook when she spoke up. Her hands no longer clenched unconsciously. She no longer scanned rooms for danger before relaxing. The world had not become safer. She had become steadier. One night, during a storm that rattled windows and darkened streets, the power went out across the neighborhood. Serene lit a candle and sat by its glow, listening to rain drum against the glass. She thought of the marble floor. The laughter. The silence. And the hand that had reached out anyway. She realized then that courage was not the absence of fear. It was memory choosing action over retreat. The next morning, power returned. Emails flooded in. Schedules resumed. But something stayed with her. At work, a new policy draft landed on her desk. It was thorough. Impressive. Technically flawless. And missing one thing. People. She sent it back with a single note. Who does this protect? The revision took longer. It was better. Years from now, no one would remember that memo. But someone would remember being protected. Selim often said later that the company's greatest asset was not its portfolio or its reach. It was its pause. The moment before decisions. The space where humanity could enter. And Serene understood that this pause had been taught long ago, by a woman who chose to be unseen so others could be revealed. On an ordinary afternoon, Serene found herself laughing freely in the break room with people she once would have avoided out of fear. She caught her reflection in the glass. She looked present. As the day ended and the building emptied, she walked past the janitor's closet again. The door was open. Light spilled inside. She closed it gently. Not to hide anything, but to honor what had already been learned. Because the story had never been about power, or tests, or even justice. It had always been about choice. The quiet kind. The kind no one applauds. The kind that changes everything anyway. The weeks rolled forward without ceremony. No announcements marked the passing of time. No chapters closed loudly. Life simply continued, carrying the quiet changes with it. Serene found that she no longer measured her days by outcomes, but by moments. A conversation that softened. A conflict that de-escalated. A person who felt a little less alone by the end of the day. Those moments added up. One afternoon, a junior staff member knocked on her door hesitantly. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. She gestured for him to come in. He sat, fidgeting with his hands. "I wanted to leave," he admitted. "I thought this place would break me. But it didn't." Serene listened without interrupting. "I just wanted you to know," he finished quietly, "that you helped." After he left, she sat alone for a long time. Not proud. Grounded. Selim began spending more time off-site. He visited branches that had long been ignored. He walked factory floors. He asked uncomfortable questions and stayed long enough to hear the answers. Some people tested him. Some doubted him. Most, eventually, trusted him. Leadership, he learned, was consistency when no one was watching. One evening, he returned late and found Serene still working. "You should go home," he said. "So should you," she replied. They smiled. Neither moved. Outside, the city hummed softly, unaware of the small recalibrations happening within its walls. Serene's past no longer haunted her the way it once had. It visited. Briefly. Like a reminder. She let it pass. One night, she dreamed of Eldra again. Not falling. Not watching. Just sitting beside her, drinking tea, eyes calm. When she woke, the feeling stayed. At work the next day, Serene noticed a subtle shift. People were no longer waiting for permission to be kind. They were doing it instinctively. A chair pulled out. A voice defended. A mistake forgiven quickly. The culture had taken root. Years later, when historians would analyze the company's growth, they would point to strategy and restructuring. They would never mention the cleaner. They would never mention the fall. But the people inside the building would know. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Serene packed up early. She walked past the front desk, waved goodbye, and stepped outside into the open air. The sky was wide. Unburdened. She stood there for a moment, breathing deeply. Her phone buzzed. A message from Selim. "Walk?" She smiled and typed back. "Yes." They met at the river, the water reflecting the fading light. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Presence was enough. As the sun disappeared, Serene thought about how many lives intersected quietly every day. How many chances existed to choose differently. How often people failed those chances without realizing it. She also thought about how often people succeeded. Far away, somewhere in the city, a cleaner finished her shift and headed home, tired but unbroken. Somewhere else, a young employee decided not to laugh when cruelty tempted her. Somewhere else still, someone noticed. And so the story continued. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But faithfully. Because the greatest transformations are not announced. They are lived. Day after day. Choice after choice. Until one day, the world feels different. And no one can quite remember when it changed. The river moved steadily beside them, indifferent to the quiet weight of reflection resting in Serene's chest. She watched the water for a long time before speaking. Sometimes I wonder who I would have become if none of that had happened, she said softly. Selim did not answer right away. Different, he said finally. Not better. Not worse. Just, unaware. She nodded. There was relief in that word. They walked until the city lights blurred into reflections, until footsteps slowed naturally, until silence stopped feeling like a pause and started feeling like a companion. When they parted, it was without ceremony. They had learned that some connections didn't need punctuation. At home, Serene cooked dinner slowly. She chopped vegetables carefully, listening to the rhythm of the knife against the board. She ate at the table instead of standing by the counter like she used to. These small rituals mattered now. They grounded her. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the office. No return address. Inside was a brief message written in shaky handwriting. I used to be cruel because it was easy. I am trying to be better. Serene folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer she kept for such things. Not trophies. Reminders. Selim faced his own tests. Investors questioned his priorities. Analysts warned that compassion was inefficient. He listened. He thanked them. Then he stayed the course. The numbers wavered. Then stabilized. Then surprised everyone. Trust, it turned out, was good business. One spring morning, the building hosted an open forum. No podium. No microphones. Just chairs arranged in a wide circle. Anyone could speak. Some did hesitantly. Some boldly. Some cried. No one was mocked. No one was rushed. The room held them all. Serene spoke last. I once believed silence kept me safe, she said. Now I know it only kept me small. Speak when it matters. Listen always. There was no applause. Just nods. As seasons passed, Serene found herself mentoring not just employees, but leaders from outside the company. People curious about what had changed. What formula had been applied. She never gave them one. There isn't a system, she told them. There's a decision you make every day. Some left disappointed. Some stayed thoughtful. Eldra's presence remained strongest in moments no one documented. In pauses before judgment. In hands that reached out instinctively. In the refusal to laugh at someone else's pain. One afternoon, Serene noticed a woman standing uncertainly by the elevator, clutching a worn bag. She recognized the posture instantly. She approached. Are you looking for someone? She asked. The woman nodded nervously. I'm here for cleaning staff orientation. I think I'm late. Serene smiled. You're right on time. She walked her to the office, waited with her, introduced her by name. The woman's shoulders relaxed. That night, Serene lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling something settle deep inside her. Completion. Not of the story. But of the fear that once defined it. She thought again of Eldra. Not as the powerful woman. Not as the tester. But as the one who chose to look. And she understood something clearly for the first time. Legacy was not what you left behind. It was what you awakened in others. The city outside her window pulsed with light and motion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New moments. New chances to choose. And when they came, she would meet them the same way she always had. With awareness. With restraint. With the quiet courage to act when no one asked her to. Because the truest stories do not end. They live on in the choices of those who heard them. And decided to carry them forward. Time did what it always did. It moved forward without asking permission. Serene stopped trying to hold on to moments once she understood that meaning wasn't lost when things passed. It simply changed shape. Some lessons stayed sharp. Others softened into instinct. She trusted the instinct now. On a quiet morning, she arrived earlier than usual and found the lobby empty. The marble floors reflected the light just as they always had. For a brief second, memory pressed in. Then it loosened its grip. She breathed. And kept walking. A new project demanded attention that season. It involved expansion into regions where labor was cheap and oversight was scarce. The proposal was profitable. Efficient. Carefully worded. Serene read it slowly. Then again. She noticed what wasn't written. The room was full when she raised her concerns. Voices resisted at first. They always did. But she didn't argue loudly. She didn't shame anyone. She asked questions. She invited answers. She stayed steady when impatience surfaced. By the end of the discussion, the plan had changed. It would take longer. It would cost more. It would protect people. Afterward, someone stopped her in the hallway. "You didn't have to push that hard," they said. She met their eyes calmly. "I didn't push," she replied. "I stood." Selim watched these moments with quiet respect. He had learned that strength didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived as consistency. As restraint. As refusal to trade values for speed. He carried that lesson into every room he entered. Outside the company, the world felt louder. Faster. More impatient. Serene noticed the contrast and understood why people struggled. Kindness required slowness. Attention required effort. She chose both anyway. One evening, she attended a small community gathering. No cameras. No sponsors. Just people sharing food and stories. She listened more than she spoke. An older man leaned toward her at one point and said, "You make people feel like they matter." She smiled gently. "They do," she said. Years layered themselves quietly. Faces aged. Hair grayed. Roles shifted. But something essential stayed intact. One afternoon, Serene received news that stopped her in place. Eldra's old home had been sold. The new owners planned renovations. She felt a brief sting. Then acceptance. Places, like people, were allowed to change. She visited the house one last time before the transfer. The rooms echoed. The shelves were empty. But the air felt peaceful. She stood in the doorway and whispered goodbye. Not to the walls. To the chapter. Later that week, Selim asked her a question he had been holding for a long time. "Do you ever regret staying?" he asked. She answered without hesitation. "No," she said. "Because staying let me become myself." They walked again by the river that evening. The water moved the same way it always had. Unbothered. Persistent. Serene realized something then. She no longer needed reminders of the past to guide her. She had become the reminder. Somewhere in the city, a new employee found courage to speak up. Somewhere else, a leader paused before making a harmful choice. Somewhere still, a quiet kindness shifted the direction of a day. No one connected these moments. No one traced them back. And that was exactly how it was meant to be. Because the truest impact is invisible. It lives in what people choose when no one is watching. And so the story kept unfolding. Not toward an ending. but toward continuity. Toward a world made slightly more humane by those who remembered. And chose, again and again, to act with care. The continuity took on a rhythm of its own. Not urgency. Not complacency. A steady pace shaped by intention. Serene stopped being surprised when people sought her out, not for answers, but for permission to pause. They came with dilemmas, not crises. With uncertainty, not panic. She gave them time. Time, she had learned, was often the most respectful response. One afternoon, a long-serving employee announced her retirement. No speeches were planned, but word spread quietly. People gathered anyway. Not to celebrate productivity, but presence. She never made me feel small, someone said simply. Serene felt that sentence settle deeply. As leadership shifted and new faces rose into responsibility, Serene stepped back more often. Not out of fatigue, but trust. She had helped build something that no longer required her constant defense. That, she realized, was success. Selim felt the shift too. He spent less time proving and more time protecting. Less time reacting and more time preparing others to lead without him. Eventually, he said one evening, "I want this place to outgrow me." Serene smiled. "That's how you know you're doing it right." The city continued to evolve. Buildings replaced old ones. Names changed. But habits lingered. So did lessons. One winter morning, during a heavy rain, a pipe burst on a lower floor. Water spread quickly. Panic followed. Then coordination. People moved together instinctively. Someone shut off the valve. Someone called maintenance. Someone guided others to safety. No one shouted. No one blamed. When it was over, the damage was minimal. What remained was quiet pride. Later, a manager said, "We handled that well." Serene nodded. "Yes," she said. Because people felt responsible for each other. Outside of work, she found herself drawn to simpler spaces. Bookstores. Parks. Cafes where conversations lingered without agenda. She spoke less about what she did. More about what she noticed. Once, a stranger asked her what motivated her. She thought for a long time before answering. "Memory," she said. "And attention." Years passed gently. Then one day, Serene realized she no longer flinched at the sound of laughter behind her. The realization surprised her. She stood still, absorbing it. Not relief. Completion. That evening, she walked through the building one last time before leaving early. She passed familiar doors. Familiar corners. Familiar light. At the janitor's closet, she paused. The door was closed. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. At home, she placed the old notebook on a shelf she rarely touched now. It no longer needed updating. The lessons had migrated inward. Selim called her later. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked. "For staying long enough," he replied. She understood. As the city settled into night, Serene stood at her window again. The skyline shimmered. Lives unfolded beyond her sight. She knew challenges would continue. Injustice hadn't vanished. Cruelty still existed. But so did choice. And somewhere, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps years from now, someone would face a moment that asked something of them. A moment that required courage without applause. A moment that would define more than it announced. And because of a story they never heard. Because of a lesson never labeled. Because of a kindness never recorded. They would choose well. That was how it continued. Not as a conclusion. But as inheritance. Passed quietly. Lived fully. And never truly finished. The inheritance moved without ceremony. It passed through gestures people barely noticed. A door held open a second longer. A voice lowered instead of raised. A decision delayed long enough to consider its weight. Serene began to feel time differently. Days no longer pressed against her like deadlines. They unfolded. She learned when to step forward and when to remain still. Both mattered. Both required intention. One morning, she received an invitation to speak at a leadership forum overseas. The offer was generous. The audience influential. The recognition tempting. She read it twice. Then declined. Instead, she spent that week sitting in on orientation sessions, listening to new hires introduce themselves with hopeful nerves and guarded smiles. Later, she wondered if anyone would ever know she had chosen that. She smiled at the thought. Selim noticed her absence at the forum. "You could have gone," he said. "I was where I needed to be," she replied. He didn't argue. He understood now that impact didn't always travel far to be real. That year, a quiet recession brushed the edges of the industry. Companies reacted with panic. Layoffs. Silence. Distance. Covain Holdings reacted differently. Hours were reduced at the top before they were touched below. Conversations replaced announcements. Transparency replaced fear. It wasn't painless. But it was shared. In the break room one afternoon, someone said quietly, "They didn't abandon us." No one responded. No one needed to. Serene watched people change under pressure. Not all of them for the better. But enough. Enough to remind her that systems didn't save people. People saved people. One late evening, she found Selim alone in the conference room, lights dimmed, papers untouched. "You're thinking too hard," she said gently. He exhaled. "I'm thinking about what happens when I'm not here." She took a seat across from him. "Then make sure what you're building doesn't depend on you," she said. He nodded slowly. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Soft. Persistent. Serene's life beyond work grew quieter and richer. She cooked more. Walked more. Let friendships deepen without urgency. She learned to sit with questions without demanding answers. Some nights, she still dreamed of marble floors. But now, in the dreams, someone always helped her up. Years later, long after the names on office doors changed again, a new leader would walk into the building for the first time. They would feel it immediately. The pause. The attentiveness. The absence of fear masquerading as efficiency. They would ask, "Why does this place feel different?" And someone would shrug and say, "It's just how we do things." No one would mention Eldra. No one would mention Serene. And that, perhaps, was the truest measure of success. Because the goal had never been to be remembered. It had been to make remembering unnecessary. The city continued to move. The river continued to flow. And somewhere between intention and action, the story continued to live. In choices repeated. In dignity preserved. In humanity practiced quietly. Again and again. The quiet practice carried on. It always did. Serene noticed that the more ordinary her days became, the more meaningful they felt. There were no sharp turns now, no dramatic revelations. Just a steady alignment between who she was and how she lived. She trusted that alignment. One afternoon, a disagreement surfaced between two longtime colleagues. Nothing explosive. Just tension that had been ignored too long. Voices tightened. Smiles thinned. Serene invited them to walk instead of talk. They circled the block once in silence. Then again. By the third lap, the words came easier. Less defensive. More honest. They didn't leave as friends. But they left with respect. That was enough. Selim often said later that he learned more from watching Serene resolve conflict than from any leadership course. She never rushed the outcome, he explained. She rushed the understanding. As seasons changed, the building filled with small rituals. Friday check-ins that weren't about numbers. Quiet acknowledgments of effort. A shared understanding that burnout was not a badge of honor. Productivity didn't suffer. It deepened. Serene found joy in watching others step into their confidence. People who once waited for permission began initiating change. People who once stayed silent began asking questions. She resisted the urge to guide too closely. Growth needed space. One evening, she received a message from someone who had left the company years earlier. I didn't understand it then, the message read. But I do now. I'm trying to build the same thing where I am. Serene read it twice. Then closed her phone and sat quietly, letting the meaning settle. That night, she dreamed of the building empty. No people. No voices. Just light filling the space. When she woke, she felt no fear. Only peace. Years later, when Serene finally stepped away from her role, there was no announcement. No farewell speech. She simply stopped coming in every day. Others filled the space naturally. As they should. On her last unofficial visit, she walked the halls slowly, hands brushing walls that no longer felt heavy. She paused by the window overlooking the city, watching the river trace its patient path. She thought of how much had changed. And how much had stayed the same. Outside, life moved forward. Inside, something steady remained. Somewhere, a person would face a choice that felt small but carried weight. Whether to speak. Whether to listen. Whether to look away. And because of a culture they inherited without knowing its origin, they would choose presence over convenience. They would choose dignity. That was how the story endured. Not through repetition. But through embodiment. Because the most powerful stories are not told. They are lived quietly. Until they become the way things are done. The way things were done became invisible over time. Not because they disappeared, but because they no longer needed explanation. Serene adjusted to her days without a title the same way she had learned to adjust to everything else, by paying attention. Mornings slowed. Afternoons opened up. She discovered how much of her identity had been built not on position, but on presence. She liked that. She volunteered more now, not as a leader, not as a speaker, but as a pair of hands. Sorting. Cleaning. Listening. People told her their stories without knowing hers, and she let it stay that way. There was freedom in being unknown. Occasionally, someone from the company would call. A question. A doubt. A moment of hesitation. She never gave directives. She asked questions. They always found their own answers. Selim visited once, years later, sitting across from her at a small cafe near the river. You know, he said, stirring his cup, people still talk about the shift. She smiled. Do they know why it happened? He shook his head. They just say it feels human. She looked out at the water, sunlight breaking across its surface. That's enough, she said. The city had changed. New sounds. New faces. But the river stayed. It always did. Serene walked often now, letting her thoughts wander without destination. She noticed details she once missed, the way people avoided eye contact when they were unsure, the way relief softened shoulders when someone felt seen. She noticed how often pain hid behind competence. One afternoon, a stranger stumbled in the street, papers scattering everywhere. Before Serene could think, she knelt to help. So did someone else. They exchanged a brief smile. Nothing more. Everything enough. As years layered gently, Serene felt no urge to look back with regret or longing. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. It had done its work and stepped aside. She respected that. Sometimes, late at night, she thought of Eldra. Not as a symbol. Not as a lesson. But as a woman who once chose to kneel instead of stand above. That choice echoed still. Somewhere, in a building she no longer entered, a young person hesitated before laughing at someone else's mistake. They paused. They didn't laugh. They helped instead. No one applauded. No one recorded it. And yet, something shifted. That was how it worked. Not once. But endlessly. The world did not become kind overnight. But it became possible. And that possibility lived on, not in stories told aloud, but in moments chosen quietly, again and again, by people who would never know how much they carried forward. And so the story continued. Unfinished. Unclaimed. Alive. Alive, and moving in ways no one could chart. Serene felt it most clearly on mornings when she woke without an agenda. The kind of morning that once would have made her restless now felt like a gift. She brewed tea slowly, letting the steam rise, letting the day arrive instead of chasing it. She had learned that urgency was often borrowed fear. On one such morning, she received a message from a former colleague. "I'm struggling," it read. "Not with work. With doubt." They met later that week. No office. No structure. Just two people sitting on a bench beneath a wide sky. Serene listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fix. When the words finally ran out, she spoke softly. "You're allowed to grow at your own pace," she said. "Even here." Tears came then. Quiet ones. That was the work now. Unseen. Unmeasured. Across the city, the company continued to evolve. New leadership brought new ideas, new challenges, new tensions. But the pause remained. The instinct to ask who would be affected before deciding. People called it culture. But culture, Serene knew, was just memory practiced collectively. One afternoon, she visited the old building again, not to revisit the past, but to attend a small exhibition in the lobby. Photographs lined the walls, employees, teams, moments captured without staging. In one corner was a photo of a cleaner laughing with two engineers during a break. No names. No captions. Serene stood there longer than most. A young woman beside her spoke without looking away from the image. "I like this one," she said. "It feels honest." Serene nodded. "It is," she replied. Outside, the city carried on. Some days were kind. Some were not. But fewer people felt alone inside them. That mattered. As years stretched forward, Serene noticed how her reactions had softened even further. When frustration appeared, it passed quicker. When disappointment arrived, it no longer hollowed her out. She had learned to trust continuity. One night, she dreamed again. This time, she was standing in a long corridor filled with doors. Each door opened briefly as she passed, revealing moments she recognized. A meeting where someone chose patience. A hallway where someone chose restraint. A break room where someone chose kindness. She woke with a steady breath and a calm heart. Far away, someone new would soon arrive at the company. Nervous. Watchful. Carrying their own history of silence. They would expect the familiar signals: dismissal, indifference, hierarchy. They would not find them. Instead, they would find pauses. Listening. Room to exist. And they would not know why it felt different. They would only know that it did. That was the final truth Serene carried with her. Change that lasts does not announce itself. It settles. It stays. And long after the origin is forgotten, the impact continues to move, quietly, steadily, through lives that never meet, connected only by the choices they make when it matters most. It moved on, quietly, without asking to be named. Serene stopped thinking of her life as a series of chapters. It felt more like a long breath now, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, but never broken. She understood that meaning didn't come from milestones anymore. It came from attention. From staying awake to the moment she was in. One afternoon, while volunteering at a small community center, she noticed a boy sitting alone near the wall. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't sad in an obvious way. He was simply unseen. She sat a few feet away, not crowding him. After a while, she said, "Do you come here often?" He shrugged. They sat in silence again. Eventually, he spoke. "I don't like loud places." She nodded. "Me neither." That was all it took. Later that evening, she walked home slowly, thinking about how often people mistook silence for emptiness. How often the quietest people carried the most. She had once been one of them. Across town, the company hosted another orientation. New voices filled the rooms. New energy. New uncertainty. A manager noticed someone hanging back and did something small, introduced them first, gently, without pressure. It felt natural now. No one questioned it. Selim, older now, watched from a distance. He no longer felt the need to shape every outcome. He trusted what had been built. Good systems, he once said, teach people how to be decent without needing heroes. Serene smiled when she heard that. As the years layered on, she found herself less interested in legacy and more interested in presence. She didn't ask whether her life had mattered. She asked whether she was paying attention today. That question guided everything. One night, during a power outage that dimmed her neighborhood, she lit a candle and sat by the window. The city softened in the dark. Sounds slowed. People spoke lower. She thought about how often light blinded as much as it revealed. And how darkness, when shared, could feel gentle. In another part of the city, someone chose not to send a harsh message they had already typed. They paused. Rewrote it. Sent something kinder. They never knew why they paused. Only that it felt right. Serene slept well that night. Time continued to do its quiet work. People aged. Places changed. But the habit of noticing endured. And that was the truth no one ever documented. That the world didn't change because one powerful person decided to be kind. It changed because kindness became ordinary. So the story did not end. It thinned out. It spread. It lived in thousands of moments too small to headline, but too important to lose. And somewhere, every day, someone stood at the edge of a choice. To look away. Or to see. And more often than before, they chose to see. Seeing became easier with practice. Serene noticed that people rarely resisted kindness once they felt safe enough to receive it. What they resisted was being judged while they were vulnerable. Once that fear dissolved, something gentle took its place. Trust. On a warm afternoon, she sat in a public library reading room, surrounded by strangers sharing silence. A woman across from her struggled quietly with a stack of forms, erasing and rewriting the same line over and over. Serene slid a spare pen across the table. The woman looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she said. Serene nodded and returned to her book. Nothing more was needed. Moments like that stitched the days together. The company, years removed from its turning point, faced challenges no one could have predicted. Technology shifted. Markets tightened. Expectations grew sharper. But the pause remained. Before decisions. Before judgments. Before reactions. A young leader once asked in a meeting, "What's the rush?" No one laughed. They considered it. Selim, now rarely in the spotlight, smiled when he heard about that meeting later. "That question," he said quietly, "is everything." Serene's life felt full without being crowded. She learned when to say yes and when to rest. She learned that helping didn't require exhaustion, and caring didn't require sacrifice of self. Balance was its own kind of courage. Some nights, she sat by the river alone, watching reflections stretch and break with the current. She thought about how easily water adapted, never resisting change, never losing itself. She admired that. In a distant office, a new employee hesitated before speaking up in a meeting. Their heart raced. Old instincts warned them to stay quiet. But something in the room felt different. They spoke. They were heard. That single moment altered the course of their confidence. They carried it forward. Serene often thought about how lives intersected without touching, how one decision rippled outward in directions no one could trace. The beauty of that anonymity comforted her. One evening, a child at the community center asked her, "Why do you help people?" She thought carefully before answering. "Because someone helped me once," she said. "And I learned how much it mattered." The child nodded, satisfied. Simple truths often were. As years continued to layer gently, Serene no longer searched for meaning. She recognized it when it appeared. In pauses. In restraint. In ordinary courage. The story moved on, carried by people who never knew its origin, shaped by choices that felt small in the moment and immense in consequence. And in that quiet continuity, something rare endured. A world not perfected, but softened. Enough to make room for those still finding their way. The room for finding one's way never closed. Serene saw it in faces that arrived uncertain and left lighter, even when nothing tangible had changed. Sometimes all a person needed was the sense that they were allowed to exist without performance. She had once needed that too. On a slow afternoon, she wandered through a small market near her neighborhood. Vendors called out cheerfully. Someone played music that drifted unevenly through the air. She stopped to watch an elderly man carefully arrange fruit, placing each piece as if it mattered. She waited until he finished before buying anything. "Take your time," she said when he apologized. He smiled, relieved. That smile stayed with her the rest of the day. Across the city, the company faced another crossroads. Automation promised efficiency but threatened displacement. The decision wasn't simple. It never was. This time, the conversation began differently. "How do we bring people with us?" someone asked. Not after the decision. Before it. Training programs replaced abrupt exits. Transitions replaced ultimatums. Some people still left. But they left prepared, supported, and seen. That mattered. Selim, hearing about it later, felt a quiet certainty. The pause had survived him. Serene continued her days without ceremony. She mentored when asked. She listened when needed. She stepped back when the moment wasn't hers. She trusted that timing, like kindness, could not be forced. One night, she attended a small gathering where people shared stories about moments that changed them. No one spoke of triumphs. They spoke of being noticed. Of being spared humiliation. Of being given time. When it was her turn, she simply said, "Someone once chose to kneel instead of look away." That was all. The room understood. As the seasons cycled, Serene felt gratitude without nostalgia. She didn't long for the past. She honored it by not repeating its mistakes. She had learned that healing wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive. Somewhere, a leader chose patience over pressure. Somewhere else, a coworker defended someone who wasn't present. Somewhere still, a person decided not to laugh at another's pain. These moments did not add up neatly. They wove. And in that weaving, the story continued. Not as a single thread, but as a fabric strengthened by quiet care. No ending waited at the edge of it. Only continuation. Only choice. Only the steady, human work of noticing. And responding with dignity. The work of noticing never asked for rest. It only asked for willingness. Serene learned that some days she noticed easily, almost instinctively. Other days, she had to remind herself to slow down, to soften her gaze, to return to presence. She didn't judge herself for the difference. Consistency, she understood, didn't mean perfection. It meant return. One morning, while waiting at a bus stop, she overheard a quiet argument between a mother and her daughter. Nothing harsh. Just tired voices brushing against each other the wrong way. The daughter's shoulders slumped. The mother looked away, regret already settling in. The bus arrived. They boarded. Serene offered her seat without a word. The mother hesitated, then accepted. Later, as they got off, the woman whispered, "Thank you. Today was heavy." Serene nodded. "I know," she said. The world continued to hand people heavy days. That never changed. What changed was how many hands reached out when the weight showed. At the company, long after Serene had stepped away, a new generation took responsibility. They didn't know the origin story. They didn't need to. They spoke the language fluently anyway. Questions before conclusions. People before processes. Care before speed. A visiting consultant once remarked, "There's a strange calm here." No one answered. They were too busy working. Selim retired quietly. No gala. No farewell tour. He left behind notes, not instructions. Principles, not rules. One of them reads simply. Pause long enough to remember who this affects. Serene read that note years later and smiled. Her days grew simpler still. She tended plants on her windowsill. She read books slowly. She wrote letters by hand. She allowed life to be unremarkable. There was peace in that. Sometimes, strangers told her things. On trains. In lines. On benches. She listened without trying to carry what wasn't hers. Presence was not possession. One evening, as she walked along the river again, she noticed how the light fractured across the water, never the same shape twice, yet always familiar. She thought about how stories worked the same way. They didn't repeat. They reflected. Somewhere nearby, laughter rang out, not sharp, not cruel, but warm. She noticed the difference instantly. She smiled. The world was still imperfect. Still unfair. Still capable of harm. But it was also capable of learning. And that, Serene knew, was enough to keep choosing attentiveness. Enough to keep kneeling when standing would be easier. Enough to keep seeing, even when no one asked her to. The story continued not because it was remembered, but because it was practiced. Every day. In quiet ways. By people who never knew they were carrying it forward. Only that something inside them insisted on care. And so it lived on. Not ending. Not fading. Simply moving. As long as someone chose to notice. The truth is, endings don't arrive all at once. They arrive quietly. They arrive when nothing dramatic is happening. They arrive when a moment passes, and something inside you realizes it no longer hurts the way it used to. Serene understood that on an ordinary morning. No meetings waiting. No decisions pressing. Just light moving across the floor. She stood still and listened to the silence. Not the heavy kind. The settled kind. Long ago, she had learned what it felt like to disappear in plain sight. To be laughed at. To be unseen. To believe that dignity was something you had to earn. But standing there now, she knew something else just as clearly. Dignity was never given. It was recognized. Somewhere in the city, a woman rushed into a building, already apologizing for existing. Somewhere else, a young man lowered his voice instead of raising it. Somewhere still, a leader paused before making a decision that would affect lives they might never meet. None of them knew each other. None of them knew this story. And yet, they were connected. Because the world doesn't change when powerful people are exposed. It changes when ordinary people choose differently. Years ago, someone fell on a cold marble floor. People laughed. Someone watched. And one person chose to kneel. That choice did not echo loudly. It did not make headlines. But it moved. From one moment. To another. To another. It moved through offices and streets. Through homes and quiet conversations. Through pauses before words were spoken. And now, it lived somewhere new. Maybe in you. Because every day, you are offered the same quiet choice. To look away. Or to see. To stay silent. Or to speak with care. To stand above. Or to kneel beside. You won't always get it right. No one does. But every time you try, something shifts. Inside you. Inside the room. Inside the world, just a little. That is how change survives. Not through force. Not through fear. But through people who decide that kindness will not be optional. So when you leave this story, don't carry the characters with you. Carry the awareness. Carry the pause. Carry the courage to act when no one is watching. Because somewhere, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, someone will need what you choose to give. And they may never know your name. But they will feel the difference. If this story moved you. If it made you stop, even for a moment. Then let it keep moving. Backhand index pointing right, like the video so more people can find it. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe for more stories that remind us who we can be. Backhand index pointing right, and comment below, tell us what part stayed with you. Because stories don't change the world. People do. And now, the choice is yours.